infrastructure for development. I met Mark a little over a year ago, and he's extremely passionate about this topic, and it's actually a critically important topic as we look to the integration of our efforts to deliver sustainable development to not just smallholder farmers, but actually to urban populations as well. So Mark is coming to us as CEO of GPC Group, a company that he established, but he has 33 years of experience in GIS and its application for development. And through those years, he's worked on over 230 GIS projects in 68 countries. And what I really appreciate about Mark is that he just brings us these diverse perspectives to bear on the application of geospatial data to support development. And he's been working recently in, is it Belize, Mark, where he's really worked across sectors to use geospatial as an anchor to integrate different departments for development. And it's been extremely impactful. And he wants to take those learnings and spread them to other countries, including here in India. So that's one of the reasons why he's here, is to help us think through how to unlock the potential of geospatial data and to think of it in different terms. It's not just GIS. It's actually a framework that allows integration, insights, and ultimately delivering on long-term development in a more efficient and effective manner. So I know that Mark's going to be touching on all of those in his talk, Spatial Data Infrastructure for Development. So Mark, really look forward to your presentation, and thank you again for coming and joining us here at ICRISAT. I met Mark in Abu Dhabi about a month and a half ago, and the focus there was really on development, but really 2/3 of the presentations touched on the application of geospatial data. So Mark, please, when you have a, yeah, are you ready to go? But he's all over the place, and I really value his insights and creative partnerships that he's fostered. Even in my time at the Gates Foundation, he was at a convening where we were looking at how to unlock geospatial data, and he had tremendous practical insights that he offered a larger group. So I really appreciate that. Mark, please.
Thanks, David. I've got something to keep me honest here, so stay on time. Thanks for coming this afternoon. And this whole issue is very, very interesting to me, because we've spent I spent most of the last 30 years working on the application of GIS and with government organizations and implementing it within those groups for their enterprise purposes, what we call as their sort of specific area of business. But what evolved over the years is this notion of spatial data infrastructure, which essentially means that organizations get together and share information, and there are many implications of that. And we've seen the implications of that in, let's say, industrialized countries, and I see huge potential within those countries with developing economies. I just want to touch on that a bit today. Now, I'm going to cover a couple of things here, and some of it quite quickly, because I suspect that most people here at ICRISAT are pretty familiar with GIS. Okay, just a quick show of hands who considers themselves to be quite familiar. Okay, and then how many of you would consider yourselves to be very familiar with spatial data infrastructure? A less number. Okay, good. So I'm going to breeze through the GIS part very quickly. So, GIS obviously is this computerized system for mapping and intelligent maps. And of course, it's used for cartography. Many people, use it to make maps and showing facilities and land tenure and many issues. But we can really think about it as a way to convert the real world and to model it in ways that we can actually analyze and simulate its behavior, right? So understanding current conditions and then thinking about projections into the future. And so if we structure the information correctly, yes, we can use it for cartography, but beyond that, we can use it for all kinds of analytical purposes, be they urban, para-urban, rural, etc. And it allows us to use the geospatial dimension of information to integrate. So for example, in Abu Dhabi, they're just now implementing a comprehensive street addressing system, One of the things that they'll be able to do as soon as that's completed is that will then allow them to tie together all the databases that all these different entities, whether it's utilities or the building permit people or people that are, delivering products and services to places. It links it together. And maybe I don't know originally how or why I might link those together, but it provides a geospatial link in there that's got like a latent interoperability that I can possibly use later on. This opens up many dimensions, and I'll just tell one of these 6 stories real quick, this thing on the upper left here. And this is actually possible in Abu Dhabi today. So you can imagine a fire breaks out in a building. Well, what do we do, right? Well, number one, the people at the civil defense are tied into that, so they can dispatch the fire trucks to there. The health operating authority can issue the ambulance, and the police for traffic control and other things. But also it can issue a thing to the Environment Agency. The Environment Agency is keeping track of where all the poisonous materials, hazardous materials are being stored. So if there's anything there that may turn into a hazard to the responders, if it burns, let's say for example chlorine, I can immediately calculate, well, what's the hazard there? Because I'm tied into the National Meteorological Service, I also know what the wind speed and direction is. So if it's something like chlorine, when it burns, it creates a poisonous cloud, I know where that cloud's going to go. And because I'm also tied into the health authority, and I know if there's any, clinics, hospitals, other kinds of medical facilities that are in the way of that, I can automatically notify them. Because I'm tied into the schools, I can find out, are there any kindergartens, primary, secondary schools that are in the way of that cloud in the next 10 minutes. And I can, send out a notice to them. And likewise, if I'm tied into the phone company, I can do a reverse, what we call 911 call, emergency call, telling people with their phones in that area of potential impact, move out of that area as quickly as you can. Now, not one of those things that I just said requires a map. It's essentially just using in the background these geospatial operators to figure out these relationships and cause actions to happen. And that's just a different way to think about GIS as other than just mapping. Now, in the old days, we used to have these, processes by which people, specialized survey capabilities, et cetera, would basically compile all this information through a very extensive photogrammetric engineering or field survey process. That's shifting now today to a business process approach, because the reality is that anything that we actually need to measure or record, it's probably somebody's job somewhere to do that. All we have to do is know whose job that is and make sure that they have the capability to do it, and that we've got the framework for then sharing that information together. And that means that everything starts to get basically updated on a transaction basis. So things are updated on a daily, hourly, weekly, monthly, whatever the basis is for that particular subject. Of course, the technology is being used across all sectors today. So in addition to agriculture and things that you know very well, in land records and topographic base mapping and physical land use planning, environmental management, economic development, et cetera. So in the, let's say in the industrialized economies, that's a very well established field of operation. But then this has then evolved into something we call spatial data infrastructure. So what happened back in the 80s, people in early 90s, people were using the technology to do specific projects. You'd create data, you'd do your analysis, you'd feed it into whatever your project was, you're finished with it, it goes onto a disk and to a shelf. But later on, people figured out, hey, we keep investing, in this information. Maybe, within our department, maybe we need to get better about this. So in the late 80s and 90s, people started getting organized about enterprise GIS, within ministries or within departments or within businesses. That then evolved into this notion by 1994, where the Clinton administration in the US was the first one to declare a national spatial data infrastructure. Now, they didn't invent this idea. People were already doing national GIS, but it was the first time that the term infrastructure was used. And that was very important because it resonated with people and they could understand, oh, it's like the electrical system. We need to get organized about how we feed geospatial information to different organizations from the same, from the distributed generation source. So we had to invent then this notion of SDI, which meant then we had to pay a lot of attention to the policies, the regulations, and the governance that actually allows and facilitates that information sharing to happen. And if you look at then the progression of technology since that time, since 1982 when my career started, and if you know ArcGIS and ArcInfo, ArcInfo 1.0 came out about 6 months after I started working at Esri at that time. It evolved very rapidly, and today we have this plethora of tools, geospatial tools, and we've got Google Maps, and we have all these different things. But what's really interesting is now there's a whole world of other technologies that are becoming geospatially aware. So if you look at geospatial social media and what's happening now within all those different fields, or if you look at intelligent infrastructure and all of the location-aware devices and network-aware devices that are being inserted into our transportation systems, into the utilities, into buildings, etc., as well as then sense networks. So anybody who's carrying around a cell phone these days is basically part of a sense network, and there's all kinds of information that can be gleaned and analyzed and used in some interesting ways. And then, of course, once we've got this fire hose of information, we've got to figure out, how do we actually make, good purpose out of it? How do we mine this information for ways that can value add to whatever my purpose is? Because at the end of the day, if it's not supporting very practical kinds of applications, then we just have a lot of information floating around. But what this does is basically opens up a whole world of opportunities that even a decade ago we couldn't have even imagined, right? So it's taking, what's happening is the technology is going really fast and really opening up all kinds of huge new opportunities, but our institutional evolution is a lot slower process, and it takes a lot more work to get that to keep up. So getting government structures or institutional structures to basically take advantage of all those new opportunities is an interesting challenge. And we've characterized kind of the growth of spatial data infrastructure over the years like the web, kind of 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. And we think 3.0 is getting into a point where now it's actually going to start transforming those governments that are using it. So we're not using new tools to do old things more efficiently. We're actually using this as a way to reinvent what we do in new ways that represent kind of I don't know if you know the term disruptive, but it's a way of kind of changing for the better, transforming the way we used to do things. Now that's kind of a developed country perspective. If we look at this in the developing world, it requires kind of a different paradigm, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I just wanted to show some of the examples. The first one is poverty mapping, because this has been done forever by the World Bank, and they have a huge amount of information that they've made available publicly now over the last 2 years. They've kind of opened up their data archives, a huge amount of information coming out of World Bank, and hopefully the UN and other agencies are going to follow suit. But the basis of kind of understanding where underserved poverty exists and populations exist, and understanding the sources of poverty, the reasons for poverty, and trying to understand the dynamics of overcoming poverty is important. Obviously in project monitoring and evaluation, so you can imagine when I have all the donors and technical assistance agencies, multilaterals, bilaterals coming in, each organized by sector, they're coming in and they're supporting governments which are also organized by sectors. So we're stacking sectors on sectors and then lacking the lateral integration and visibility as to where is all that investment going. So the idea of mapping the locations and the characteristics and the status gives us a much better, let's say, platform for understanding where investment is being put, and better coordination, hopefully, through that process. And then being able to tie those results, the cumulative results in terms of cumulative monitoring and assessment, back into then cumulative outcomes or impacts from that to see, are we really making a difference in the way that we intended. Obviously, in the area of agriculture and food security, an area of focus for you folks here, and there's a whole, emerging field, I think, here in this kind of agroinformatics and a bunch of very interesting things that are coming together here. And that has two dimensions, I think. One is the dimension internally to the sector and how we look at agriculture and increasing agricultural production and the whole farm to fork value chain analysis and how we connect all these things. But then, increasingly, we need to figure out how does this then tie back into kind of the food, energy, water nexus and the whole development issue and basically the achievement of what later this year will be called the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, in the UN system. Not disconnected from that, of course, then is water security. Understand where the water resources are, understanding the quantity and quality, understanding the trends, understanding the demand and where the demand is going. It's being used across many countries for that. Humanitarian assistance for things like disaster responses or civil strife. Tracking internally displaced people and getting resources to those people. Cadastral survey and land registration, the whole issue of land tenure, and various levels of land tenure, because anymore we need to have a grayscale. It's obvious we can't have like full Torrens title on every piece of land on the planet. It takes too much time and effort to do that, and frankly is not needed in many cases. So there are many ways that, for example, slums or people in remote areas are actually taking proactive steps to establish their legitimacy of use of a piece of land that then has certain rights that come along with that. Disaster management, and looking at this in terms of full cycle disaster management, knowing where the hazards are, knowing where the vulnerable people and resources are, being able to develop contingency plans around that knowledge, being able to support response if and when a disaster happens, and then tying back into the whole, post-disaster recovery, but then that all folding back into doing a better job of disaster-resistant community planning and design. And that basically I'd say that this has a close tie into climate change, because obviously a lot of these natural disasters and things are being driven or affected by climate change. And just one observation is that GIS has played heavily into pretty much every major disaster event since the early 1990s, including the most recent things here in the Himalayas. Demining, especially in post-conflict and fragile states, a very interesting statistic here. It costs, what is it, $3 to $10 to put a mine in the ground. It's $300 to $1,000 to take that out. And it's primarily, statistically children, things that are actually most impacted by mines still being in the ground. So it's important to keep track of those and to track the removal. Renewable energy, this crosses the board in terms of solar, biomass, hydro, et cetera. And being able to understand where the renewable resources are, where the demand is, where the existing infrastructure is, and then being able to tie those things together is important as being how GIS is being used. Post-emergency reconstruction, there's a whole effort that one has to go through to be able to, respond and get people back into their communities and back into stable conditions. Health and Human Services, understanding where are my clinics, where are my hospitals, where are my medical personnel, where are my medical supplies, being able to track that across countries. Being able to track, for example, epidemiological outbreaks, something like Ebola when it came out, the WHO was criticized for not responding quickly enough. Well, I think part of that is just making sure that we've got the infrastructure set up so that people can self-report, et cetera. We've got channels for these things because the connectivity is there these days. We just have to be able to notice these things early and get the information to those who need to act. The educational sector is a big one, and this is not only in terms of technical training for young people that want to work in the field, but also getting people to think about problems and issues geographically or place-based way, and teaching kids, for example, not just how to, being knowledgeable in a particular sector, but knowing how to work with others, because I think solving tomorrow's problems requires interdisciplinary collaboration and really being able to come up with sustainable, persistent solutions. Climate change then is a lens that, basically colors a lot of these things across the board. We need to be able to think about the projection of climate change and its potential impacts on these different factors, and then looking at kind of mitigation and resilience and how we're going to respond to these in all of our programs across all sectors. Environmental conservation, especially these days in terms of the community inclusion within conservation efforts, because in much of the world where I need to do conservation is proximal to where I've got populations who actually rely on those resources. So I can't just put a theoretical fence around a piece of property and expect it to be conserved. I really have to figure out how to align those interests with local community interests. And this takes many different interesting forms. I have a friend who works in the Amazon with indigenous people, previously uncontacted people, and he's got them actually using Android phones marking their traditional territories, which becomes very interesting for then tracking where logging and illegal logging, as well as mineral extraction and other extractive resource leases are being made. Governance and democracy, I think we all saw, for example, during Arab Spring, what happened with social media, etc. And then there's other applications like what the group USAID came up with for tracking election irregularities using cell phones. Place-aware cell phones became a very interesting thing, and USAID's really expanded from that original base very quickly. And then this all ties back into green economy. In other words, how do we really help to develop sustainable development approaches that basically optimize local resources, indigenous capacity, and really shape solutions and interventions that are very much responsive to the specific conditions and requirements and priorities of local communities. Now, why is SDI critical for development then in this environment? Well, so what I'd noticed from kind of working in both worlds is that really SDI in the developed world has been shaped around the basic premise that, hey, doesn't it make sense for us to share information, therefore we don't have to invest in that information redundantly. And certainly that's the case, but what I found is that when you go into a developing economy situation, there's much more focus on basically this reconciling this issue of better development coordination and finance, right? And project de-risking, so better project formulation, etc. Now what happens is we've got all these different projects being proposed and conducted by all these different actors, and some of them interacting directly with government, some not, some NGOs jumping in without government coordination, with all different sources of financing, etc. And really nobody has the perspective over all of those different things. Now if you look at all those projects, for example in Belize, where I looked at, I think it was about 140 public sector investment projects that were being carried out over the last 3 years, what I found out was about 70% of those had geospatial data they were creating as part of the project, and there was nobody that knew that that was happening. There were people who knew bits and pieces, but nobody had the whole picture. The only group that held the whole picture was the Ministry of Finance, but they're not spatial people. They think in terms of numbers, right? So they weren't recognizing the alignment potential within what they were seeing in terms of project portfolios. So that investment's already being made, but it's not being optimized. It's essentially being lost, because when people finish these things, essentially it goes on a shelf. And by the way, none of the multilaterals or the bilaterals currently has a policy that recognizes spatial data infrastructure as an enabling environment for development, right? Neither do they require that the data that gets created out of a project, unless it's specifically defined as an output of that project, to repatriate that information back to the government. So what happens is the data goes into CDs or whatever, or in a report, and it goes on a shelf and it just sort of disappears. And there's billions of dollars a year across the world of investment that is lost in that way. So why does this matter? Well, one other dimension of this is that when we look at information and risk, when we look at the notion that if we have less information, we have many more unknowns. Therefore, we have inherent risk. We in fact don't know what the risk is. Now, if we have more information, it doesn't necessarily decrease the risk of a project, but it increases our awareness of what the risks are so that we can make more rational judgments about investment. Now, this is actually very important for a couple of reasons. One is to do better project formulation and more defensible project formulation from the beginning. And one thing that we found out is that the sovereign funds of the world, for example, have something like double the money that the World Bank and all the multilaterals and bilaterals together, have 5 times as much information available. Now those guys, they don't invest in the same kind of projects that the World Bank and USAID and the DFID and the other guys invest in, because their job is to maximize the return on investment for that's their fiduciary responsibility to their citizens. And they say, look, we would invest there if World Bank and these other guys would do a better job of de-risking projects, right? And that for me turned on the light bulb, because that's bankers talking to bankers. And before I was just really struggling trying to get these guys to recognize that spatial data infrastructure could support them. But when they say, hey, you de-risk the project, I'll invest. Oh, by the way, oh yeah, okay, I can use that information to do that de-risking process, right? So that sort of closes the loop on that investment discussion in a very kind of critical way. Then the concept is, well, okay, now how do we get this information to be commonly available? It doesn't mean necessarily we have to put it all into one physical repository. What it does mean is that we need to create some kind of a framework. It can be a virtual framework or a physically centralized framework that we can then know that this data exists and be able to access and use it as a baseline kind of an issue. And then, beyond that, we also need this policy requiring that the data be repatriated back to government. So the same way we've got social and environmental safeguards as part of these lending frameworks, I think we need some kind of data safeguard that, make sure that if there's investment information, get it back, to somebody who can use it. Now that is like the chicken and the egg issue, because a lot of times there's not anybody in government capable to know what to do with it or that has the infrastructure to support it. So that then requires a policy that underscores and acknowledges this idea of the SDI as being an enabling environment and therefore an investable line item in my portfolios. Right now it doesn't exist there. So when you go to USAID or you go to World Bank, their country offices, and they say, that sounds like a fantastic idea. Let's get everybody around the table. Everybody says, that's a fantastic idea. And they say, okay, now who's going to take this on? Who's going to champion this? And they say, well, I'm just agriculture. I can't care. Or I'm just, municipal development, or I'm just health, and you can't find anybody that has the mandate to take on the whole thing. And so so I think that there's a policy issue there that really needs to change. And then, of course, you need to develop the capacity, not only the central government capacity to manage, to use, and to disseminate this information as it becomes available, but you need to be able to cycle back and build the capacity of each of these different sectoral custodians of the information to make sure that they've got the capacity to maintain the information that's logically part of their mandate, right? You can't just say, you're mandated to do this, now go do it. They need to have the capacity to do that. And we've used SDI and this whole community of people in SDI in different places as a way to basically acknowledge as a community that piece of information is needed, and therefore, Mr. Minister of Finance, who's going to assign the budget to help them build that capacity, when they see a whole community requesting that, it makes a big difference than if it's just a single ministry requesting that. Then of course there's this whole world of other information that's becoming available that is going to be very interesting in terms of all the social media and sense networks and all these things. And this is where I think that, you know, developing countries actually have an opportunity to leapfrog all the mistakes and stumbles and things that have happened elsewhere, and to be able to incorporate some of these things in a very interesting way, the same way that cell phones kind of leapfrog landlines. Just one last thing here to cover. What we've noticed over time is this whole idea of spatial data infrastructure is a top-down construct, right? It's conceived by leaders who want to know what the heck's going on across my jurisdiction. And they see this as an advantage so that they can kind of have a macro scope on what's going on. But we are always frustrated when we can't really make a direct connection from what we're doing down to the ground, right? Is this really helping that local farmer, right? And so what we started looking at is, well, what if we kind of flip some of this on its head and think about it from the bottom up, right? Now, what is it that we can think about there? Well, we looked around the world and we're actually fascinated by this whole trend in information and information communications technology for development, ICT 4D. And what's happening is, whether it's SMS banking or you know, remote agricultural extension by the mobile phone, or telehealth, telemedicine, or access to microfinance, all these little ICT 4D things go on. And for us, the light bulb kind of came on. We said, hey, you know, this sounds a lot like GIS back in the 1980s, where, you know, a guy over here is doing it great for forestry, a guy over here for agriculture, a guy over here for physical planning. But it wasn't until the SDI notion kind of came together and put these pieces together that we got that synergy. So we're thinking, well, it'd be really interesting if these things are successful on their own part, what if we're able to combine them and get some synergy out of this? And another thing that drove this was a speech that Hernando De Soto, the famous Peruvian author and the author of The Mystery of Capital, did at the Eye on Earth Summit, where he was looking at the source of the Arab Spring. He said, look, 2/3 of the world lives on less than $3 a day. If you live on less than $3 a day, you're living primarily in the informal economy. And governments are only good at supporting and engaging in the formal economy. So people in the informal economy are typically looking at government as being more a pain than being, you know, a help, right? So we're thinking, now what if you could do this really efficiently, use all this ubiquitous mobile telephony and feed really useful services, ICT 4D services, to people at that, you know, village scale. Wouldn't that, you know, be interesting? So we came up with this idea of something that we call GeoVillage. And actually we found out that here in Kerala, they have something kind of a similar idea, Akshaya centers, where they've established 600 of these little village centers with 5 PCs and 2 people that basically support the local community in accessing state-level services. And so we're going to go there in a couple days to see what they're doing. They told us, look, we're working on this idea. Some parts of it are working, some parts aren't working, and we're very happy to share with you, you know, what we think needs to be done, and have you evaluate what we're doing and how it might work. Now, at the base of this is another interesting thing, which is a lot of parts of the country, or sorry, a lot of areas of the world. The mobile telephony is outpacing electrification. Means that I've got a cell tower there, doesn't have electric power, so I've got to have a diesel generator, which is expensive and polluting, and then the local people have to figure out how to charge their cell phones, but they still don't have electrification. So there's a group, Deshi Power in Bihar State, who, with Rockefeller Foundation funding, came up with an interesting idea to establish renewable energy power plant that's sufficient to run the cell tower, as well as provide microgrid electrification out to the village. It's low voltage stuff, but it's enough to run light bulbs and small machinery. It's kind of a bridge electrification process. So that's interesting because once I've got the cell tower and I've got electrification, now I've got actually a conduit that I can put some of those GeoVillage services through. We then did a 6-month research around the world and looked at all the ICT 4D things that were working. And basically I isolated those down into a series of them which we named and described. And by the way, this, again, we're not building this from scratch. We're taking a bunch of good ideas and kind of putting them together. So kind of what we're learning from the Speed India program that started in Bihar State, which, by the way, Rockefeller is now putting in another $75 million to scale this up from the 14 villages that are up and running in Bihar State now to 1,000 villages in several states, as well as the Akshaya centers in Kerala, as well as the ICT movement, the ICT 4D movement. And what we're trying to do is put some of these pieces together in an interesting way to build some synergy. I'm going to run through these pretty quick because I don't want to go over, I don't want to be too verbose here, but just to give you a flavor. So just the notion of bringing mobile telephony and internet and email and voice over IP, that there's a lot of studies that have been done by World Bank, UN, et cetera, about what's happening with mobile telephony and its impact on local economic development, on literacy rates, on a lot of interesting impacts, for the most part positive, on local communities. The GIS part, now if you can imagine, if I've got my SDI going, my top-down thing, but I have enough detail down at the community level that I can actually provide information for better formulation of local projects and then encourage local communities to enter in their own local data over the cloud, right? So that basically they're maintaining this information and they're adding more detail that's relevant to their situation. But I'm also creating then a more effective two-way information exchange between donor and government and local communities, right? And I think if that's done right, that can really provide some interesting benefits. Being able to do then project management and monitoring, like I was showing before, how do these things we can track where projects are, what their status are, what sector is working where. Remote agricultural extension, obviously many different things that can be done. The things that people are already doing with remote diagnostics by simple emailing a photograph, for example, of a pest or fungus or something on a plant. Access to microfinance networks. There's 14,000 microfinance institutions around the world. It can't be impossible to catalog them all, be able to identify their geographic and thematic areas of interest, and be able to provide simple query tools for farmer in the highlands in Afghanistan to figure out where he can find $500 to get grape arbors to get his grapes up off the ground. This notion of trade, in other words, the market prices, et cetera. In Belize already they're doing things like this where the guys basically are using SMS into the local markets, the fishermen, and then taking their catches to wherever they're able for that particular day's catch, get the best price. Belize isn't a big place, so that's fairly practical. There's not a lot of distance between those markets. But I think there's lots of different things that could be done there and are being done. I've seen examples of this all over the world now as people are getting into this. Remote health network services. There's a whole telehealth, telemedicine potential here, and very interesting opportunities there. Being able to do mobile payments, using credits on your phone to be able to pay for any variety of things. And, you can go to a place like Kenya and now you can pay for your petrol, directly from your phone. And interesting things that are being actually pioneered in the developing world that I think the others will gain from later. Remote learning, providing access. It was interesting in Afghanistan, we went through a process they distributed these one laptop per child, these small little cheap devices. And it wasn't until they put the national curriculum on those things that actually the utilization spiked. Because they put it on there and then they put on some fun games and things that would basically get the kids to, open these things up, have a reason to get on there and use it directly in the school day with the curriculum, but also have some fun at home. Employment opportunities, all kinds of interesting ways that, web-based employment is becoming available in all kinds of different forms. I've found many interesting examples of communities now creating their own local websites and using this not only for kind of like a community bulletin board for the community to use, but a lot are actually advertising their own communities, especially if they are a tourist destination or have some potential in those areas. And, best practices and success stories. So getting communities of practice, communities of interest to be able to, share their experiences and share what they're doing. We're looking at doing this across the small island developing states because many of them, for example, share many of the common challenges, and they're kind of at the vanguard of the whole climate change impact issue. And we're looking at, through the SIDSDOC program, being able to share that kind of information. At the end of the day, this idea is if you can create a bunch of these nodes and these things are providing valid service and you're able, like the Akshaya centers, to figure out how to make that work economically, which in their case, they're economically working, they're basically self-sufficient economically through operating as a internet cafe in addition to providing the channel for the services. But if I've got those pieces and they're tying into cloud-based computing, I don't have to have heavy computing power locally. I need to have it maybe at the state level. But if I'm tying those nodes together and then I'm making that information available and it's being entered and transacted upon in relatively standardized ways, now I have interesting ways of taking that bottom-up information and turning that into, let's say, more insights that can feed into decision-making and policy-making and things like that that are more at that top-down level. Therefore, trying to, bring together the top-down and the bottom-up perspectives in a way that is productive. Just the last 2 minutes here. Now, none of this is easy, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways that parts of this can fail, but I'm encouraged because whenever you see the parts of something doing well on their own, and you can see the obvious synergy in bringing them together, you can only hope that that synergy can be realized. But there's still issues to think about. One, for example, no local information available. Well, in my experience, if you know how to turn over the stones, you can walk into an environment, like in Belize, it's not in this chart here, but in Belize, I ran in a few months ago. In 2 weeks, I ran into probably about 600 sources of information. They're all sitting in, file boxes and shoe boxes and spreadsheets and da-da-da, all useful stuff. None of it perfect, none of it, completely up to date, none of it standardized, etc. But it does exist. There's stuff to start with. And today we've got amazing satellite systems, et cetera, that are making a variety of information and derivative information available even where there is a dearth of data. The other risk is that people are not ready for technology. Well, if we just look at cell phone adoption, somebody was saying the other day, they're laughing because there was a guy with his plow behind his ox, and he's sitting on there, talking on his phone while he's walking along behind this thing. And so the world is getting more and more connected, and it's more and more practical to do so. And mixed media can also basically provide an avenue for the semi-literate, to get on and actually use some of these services. And once, people become confident in using services, literacy is going to come. Literacy comes with, using things and interacting with things. And so there's some very interesting things going on there. The other, technology expensive. Well, increasingly, I mean, the sensor devices, the communication devices, the communication services, all that stuff is trending down while the capabilities are trending up. And so that's, kind of opening up all kinds of things that just weren't possible before. The other is change is difficult, granted, but it's not difficult where people see the immediate benefit. It's amazing how quickly people have taken on to cell phones globally, the use of internet and social media globally, right? And you know, so I think again, it really is, where it's difficult is where it's really not helpful, or where people really don't want that information known. You know, I've run into lots of cases around the world where people said, look, you know, if you try to expose that information, there are too many people whose self-interest are being, you know, supported by that information not being visible. So, you know, don't even mention that part, you know. And so that, anyway, those are some interesting potential. So just some last points. So we know, you know, better information is needed for better development project planning and execution. And we know that if we've got better planned and coordinated projects, we should have, you know, better results, and we should get more bang for our buck. We're already investing in data. You know, I've not been able to quantify it yet, but I hope in the Belize that I can make it a showcase to show them to implement SDI. They don't need to spend a nickel more. What they need to do is be more clever about how they spend the investment that they're already doing. Leveraging this then requires high-level direction and support, because it's a challenge I'm facing in Belize. It was originally positioned as a technical initiative, and walked in there and realized that the executive awareness of the transformative implications were not there. So we had to fill that blank, and that's taking some time to make sure that the leadership there understands what this actually could mean, because it's only then that it's going to get positioned correctly in terms of the whole development coordination and finance issue. This also requires policies to make sure that information is available. So Freedom of Information Acts, intellectual property rights, privacy, security, all these things need to be considered and need to be reconciled within any environment, and every country is different in that regards. And local communities need local solutions. So we think that these ICT 4D and kind of coming up with a way, you know, there's a guy, Prevalent, Indian American author, who did Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. I think we need to come up with the EGovernment for the bottom of the pyramid, so that C.K. Prevalent's point about how we have to restructure and reframe things so that they fit the people who live on less than $3 a day can actually be productive services to them. And ultimately, this return on investment has to be realized. If we don't have the return on investment, you know, we can't go throwing donor, you know, money after these things time after time. We really have to figure out how to do this all in a way that's self-sustaining, which means that we need to tie it into private sector, government, donor, local communities, make sure that people take ownership for this, and ultimately make sure that all the stakeholders are getting what they need out of the process. Thank you very much.
Great. So I'm sure there's questions for Mark, so I'll open it up.
Please, Peter.
Mark, really good at opening up the eyes to, you know, what can happen out there. But as is my want, is a couple of challenges. Is one around information and risk. The misconception put up there that risk can be reduced, correlated directly with them, or the reduction of risk can be correlated with the amount of information. There's an element of irreducible risk out there, because we can't predict the future. Doesn't matter how much information you have, there's going to be a level of risk there. So that representation has to be challenged. And it's to what degree does extra information get you down to a level of risk that's better than intuition?
Yeah, exactly. So that's a good point. I have to figure out how to change that diagram, because what I'm verbally saying is that it doesn't reduce risk, but it makes the risk more apparent, so that when you do make decisions, and that doesn't totally address your point, because yeah, there is unpredictable risk, but again, it's better than, you know, I mean, there's ways that if with more information, one could argue that you're going to, you know, you're going to have better insights into what those risks may be, and hopefully have a better way to mitigate them. Predictive stuff, you know, there's always going to be unknowns, information or no.
I have a question. So, Mark, how do we build a business case so governments really invest in this?
Yeah, so the I'm hoping, in my own little sphere of influence, that like the Belize example, I've structured that specifically for that purpose. And I'm pulling in the Ministry of Finance, and I went through 3 years, I went through and evaluated 3 years, in addition to everything that's going on there now in terms of activities and who's doing what. I went back through 3 years of their public sector investment projects, correlated that to the data that each one of those needed, and then showed them the commonalities, which meant that they either invested redundantly in creating that information, or they made decisions and did the project without the information, which has its own sort of downside to it. There's a bunch of friendlies out there in every single one of the IFIs, International Finance Institutions, who get it, but there is no forum to collectivize that voice. Now I'm hoping that, we had a discussion about that here before, is that in much of the developing world, agriculture plays such a key role in the whole economic and social framework that through looking at agriculture as the kind of foundation business case, that we can then prove, use that as basically the poster child for this whole issue. Show, if agriculture can benefit from this, and if agriculture then can link out to all the different sectors so that I've got positive outcomes. And I think you've got two very good opportunities to do that in Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka with your engagements there at the state level. I think those are two great opportunities to really showcase how that can happen. I guess it's going to take the show me, before people are going to really recognize that they need to really see the results of it. Hi. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so, yeah, so give you an example. In Abu Dhabi, before, all the individual agencies were basically getting their own digital satellite remote sensing data, and they're, two things about that were disturbing. One, that they were just paying the vendors over and over, and there was no coordination. Secondly, they're buying the raw data, but there was very little awareness about how they could actually use that information other than just background imagery, right? So we had a discussion with the guys who run the EGovernment and the SDI program there, and said, you've got two challenges. One, you need to basically consolidate and facilitate a more organized approach to how you buy imagery as a government. The second is to know what imagery you need to buy. You need to have a better sense of what the stakeholder requirements are. But before they're going to be able to tell you what their requirements are, they need to know what the palette of possibilities is. So you need an awareness program over here and a facilitation program over here. So they've actually done that. They ran workshops, brought in people from all over to show them all the things that were possible, went through a stakeholder engagement process to figure out what the requirements are cumulatively. They used that to identify the different platforms, and then they used one entity to essentially purchase the licensing on behalf of the entire community, so that the licensing acknowledges that all those 75 members of the SDI can use that in an unlimited way, for their own purposes. And so I mean, every subject I think is going to have its own issue. One of the things we did with institutional IP is they said, look, whoever is the logical custodian of a piece of information means that their mandate and their business process, basically suggests that they should be the custodian. So that was clearly identified, and then the stakeholders for that information were likewise engaged to figure out, well, what is the specific information that we as a group need that may be different, have some difference to what the custodian needs. And if we are putting more burden on the custodian because we've got some additional needs, then they need to be compensated in terms of resources to fulfill that responsibility. But we all sign a service level agreement that basically recognizes their custodianship and their ownership, even when they're government, of that piece of information, and puts some limitations of use, if any, are acknowledged in those agreements, but it's all done in a formalized way. So it's kind of a heterogeneous, you know, a bunch of different solutions to meeting the IP issue.
Mark, we talked about it briefly this morning. You concentrated on GIS, but you touched on this whole idea of sensor networks. That you know, you're saying, I think you had a slide there about, you know, that even in traffic situations you can have, you know, sensors in signs and eventually pick up information. What do you see as the future around this idea of sensor networks? You know, in terms of being able to collect whatever data you want from whatever distribution spatially and temporally you want.
Yeah, so you know they have this term, you know, the Internet of Things, right? And that's basically suggesting that there's going to be ever more devices that are connected to each other and connected to the Internet. If they're connected to the Internet, means that if you want to, you can allow consumption by others. And that's going to become more and more interesting. You know, the other day I was researching kind of these emerging technology things, and I ran into this little thing called NetAtmo. And it's like a little personal atmospheric station. I thought, well, that's kind of cool. I wonder, probably nobody in UAE. It was like, 50 people in UAE were running these little things. And in Europe and US and Australia, there's hundreds, I mean, thousands of these things. And they're taking it and creating their own little weather maps based on these little personal devices. And more of those sensors that are going on these, you know, going into vehicles, going into buildings, going into infrastructure, et cetera, are there and available. I don't think that we're at the very tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding, once all this information is available, where are the algorithms and the interpretive approaches that we can use to turn that into actionable, you know, valuable information.
Great. Well, let's all thank Mark for his presentation. And Mark, really appreciate you taking the time to join us and share your vision and passion for this area. I share your vision and passion, so I don't know how to really thank you, because it is, I think, going to unlock a lot of potential for coordinated development. And as you say, you don't need to pay a nickel more. It's really the political will to bring all this information together and really unlock its potential through integration. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and look forward to conversations tomorrow as well, and future collaboration down the road. So again, thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and yeah, now you can see that there's several crazy people that have this vision for how to unlock geospatial data for development. So thanks for coming.